Hello, everybody. You're currently in the Mark Palmer Conference Center of Freedom House. Mark Palmer was, for a long time, a co-vice chair of Freedom House's board. He was an American diplomat who, when he was ambassador to Hungary, went into the streets with civil society before the turn that changed things in the Warsaw Pact. And we named this conference center after him. And this event is part of what we call the Palmer Forum, generously funded by his wife, Sushma Palmer, herself a board member. On behalf of Freedom House, thank you for joining us for what we think is a highly timely discussion of the ever-complicated and troubling crisis in Venezuela and prospects for positive change. For more than a decade, Freedom House has worked to protect human rights and promote democratic institutions in Venezuela. Freedom House supports civil society organizations, student groups with a special focus on youth, journalists, and human rights defenders to inform public opinion and draw domestic and international attention to the deteriorating human rights situation in Venezuela. December's parliamentary elections in Venezuela provided reason for cautious optimism. However, we've witnessed a deepening of the country's political and economic crisis in 2016. President Maduro's administration has failed to introduce economic adjustment measures to rein in the national debt or halt the crazy inflation. And despite maintaining the world's largest oil reserves, Venezuela appears unlikely to avoid a default on its debt. The situation in Venezuela amounts to a humanitarian crisis. Nowhere is this more evident than in hospitals, which lack basic supplies, equipment, and medications, and face growing shortages of electricity, soap, water, and paper. Waiting in grocery store lines for as many as 10 to 12 hours has become a daily ritual for many due to chronic shortages of food and other goods. Some have resorted to looting, which has become common in Caracas, a city that has one of the world's highest rates of crime. In recent weeks, opposition leaders have gathered millions of signatures to support a referendum to recall President Maduro. Thousands have taken to the streets in protest against his administration to demand immediate change. We have a particularly subtle and distinguished panel of experts and actors involved in this realm to share their insights on what domestic and international players can do in this challenging and disturbing situation. I'm pleased to introduce Gustavo Coronel. He's founder and for 10 years chair of a leading anti-corruption NGO in Caracas. He's author of numerous articles on corruption, economic development, and the oil industry in Venezuela. Diana Lopez is founder of Acción por la Libertad, a citizen movement committed to freedom and democracy, and she happens to be sister of Leopoldo Lopez. Hilda Ochoa Brillemburg is the founder and chair of Strategic Investment. And Hector Chamas is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, editorial page editor of El País, and now a good friend. Moderating, if there's anything moderating in his personality, moderating is our own Carlos Ponce, director for Latin American programs at Freedom House. I'll turn things over to you, Carlos.
Well, it's an honor for me to be preceded by our President Mark Lagon and his fundamental role of fighting for freedom. And under his watch, we have been improving the support that we have been providing to several countries in the region. So Freedom House is more and more engaged with several countries and has been innovating with different programs in Venezuela. We're really happy to have this panel. This panel has a mixture of experience over the time, economic approach, international approach, and the view from the battlefield, the views from family members of Leopoldo Lopez. And I believe that that's a fundamental thing because those are the victims right now in Venezuela. And also some of the unknown victims that die every day, like yesterday, Oliver Sanchez. I say that he was killed by the regime. because Oliver had cancer and the regime has been denying the treatment, has been denying the medicines. And a lot of Venezuelan has been dying because of the lack of medicine. So this poor boy who has been campaigning to obtain the medicine for a while died yesterday. So it's one of the many Venezuelans suffering right now. And that suffering right now doesn't mean that we can attribute this crisis only to the Chavez and Maduro regime. Hilda, you have been expressing your concerns for years about the way that the economy, the way that the policies, the political approach for the country for years. What you can say about this crisis? Is it something new? It's something that's going on for a while? It's something that got worse over the time? What is your impression about the situation of Venezuela?
Yeah, perhaps it's useful for this group of interested people to know that I left Venezuela in a self-exile in 1976. And I left it for two reasons. One was that I was commissioned by the Fondo de Inversiones de Venezuela, one of the first country funds, to do a study as to how large was going to be the surplus created by the increase in oil prices of the 70s, and how should it be invested. And when I did that research, I concluded that in the best of cases, the Venezuelan oil surplus that was feeding this investment fund would end by 1981, and I was doing this study in 1975. So when I saw that that was the best of cases, and that I was loaded with debt, I had come to graduate school in the United States and I had borrowed to do so. When I realized that I would only have at best 2 or 3 years to repay my debts, and then I would be confronting an economic crisis in Venezuela. And at the same time, the second reason is I witnessed that it was a country that was loaded with mismanagement and corruption. At that point in time, it was not big corruption, but it was corruption nonetheless. I was offered a job in government, and when I said I couldn't take it because the pay was not enough for me to pay back my debts, the minister who was offering me the job said, "You will never miss any money if you're a public servant." I kind of played that I had not heard what I had heard and declined the job offer and went to work for the private sector. Anyway, I left the country because I could figure out, in what turns out to be a prescient way of looking at the country, that it was a country in which I could not change much. Thank goodness there are many Venezuelans who stayed there expecting to change the country, and there are many who are there right now trying to do so, including Leopoldo Lopez. I figured I couldn't do it. I was not strong enough to do that, and I would have to fend for myself, and I joined the World Bank, where I stayed for 12 years, and then I became an entrepreneur in the United States. Venezuela faced a period of extraordinary political and economic mismanagement, which was covered up by the cycles of oil wealth and oil poverty. Sometimes the governments were better, sometimes they were worse. There was always corruption, sometimes more, sometimes less. But there was always some element of respect for the Supreme Court. Yes, you could buy judges. Yes, you could buy pretty much anybody, but not very many people, not everybody was willing to be buying a public official. And there was a kind of a balance. What really killed the country and sent it into the moral and economic decay it is facing right now is that in the 90s, oil prices collapsed. And with the collapse in oil prices, Venezuela, who's highly oil dependent, and all the oil wealth goes to the government. That's what creates the corruption, that the government then distributes that oil wealth among its friends, not among the enemies. And what happened was that the GDP per capita in Venezuela collapsed by 10% in a period of 10 years, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it was horrendous. That's what led Chavez to win the elections in a democratically elected cycle. What came afterwards, I could have never imagined. I knew Venezuela was not headed in the right direction, but I could have never imagined, and that's why I'm here. because I'm not among the people here. I'm probably the least involved as an activist. I have right now profound moral outrage as a citizen of the world when I see what's happening in Venezuela. Is an extraordinary, almost incomparable abuse of human rights, including your right to pursue a decent economic living, by an authoritarian regime, which in my mind is a dictatorship. Perhaps we should define what is a dictatorship here, and in which the government has gotten complete control of the Supreme Court, the Electoral Council. They don't have control of the National Assembly, but they have de facto control of the National Assembly because they can ignore and repudiate whatever the National Assembly decides. So I'm going to stop here.
Yeah. Perfect.
And say it is horrendous, and the world needs to know that it is horrendous.
Yeah, and get it worse by the minute. Then we're going to have some time for Q&As and continue the discussion. I think this is important to know about what is the background behind this and how this deterioration has been over the time, and then until this crisis of having this anomy in Venezuela. And at that anomy, I want to talk with Gustavo a little bit because of his experience in PDVSA. He also was the head of Transparency International in Venezuela. He has been involved with Venezuela for many years. Estimated inflation last year, 224%. A deficit of 10%. Oil prices, we lost in Venezuela, the country lost the opportunity of investing that in progress, and the country now face the reduction of the price of the oil and have to survive without that income and destroying the whole economy. We want your approach in terms of the economy, the future of Venezuela without the oil. All your experience with PDVSA and PDVSA being the main source. What is your view about what's going on there in Venezuela?
Thank you. Well, can you hear me well? Yes. Well, we all know now what the truth about Venezuela is. Even José Mujica, the former president of Uruguay, has just said that Maduro is totally insane. And probably the only U.S. supporters of Maduro nowadays are Danny Glover and Sean Penn. As you know, they got a lot of money from Chavez and also from Maduro. They probably are the only ones supporting the Venezuelan government in the U.S. The oil industry in Venezuela is currently bankrupt. It has 4 times as many employees as it had in 1999, and is producing 30% less oil than in 1999. It's also exporting 30% less oil, and 30% of the exported oil is not receiving cash payment because they are based on political deliveries of oil to Cuba and to China and Iran and other countries. So currently, PDVSA is financially and operationally broke. But the future of the oil industry in Venezuela is even less promising. As you know, our oil reserves in Venezuela are now mostly very heavy oils, full of sulfur, metals, and they require special upgrading plants to be refined. Now, these plants have never been built by this government. In 16 years, we haven't had any refineries of this type built in Venezuela. So as a result, the oil production in the Orinoco heavy oil area is totally stagnant. There is no real increase in production there. And even worse, the future of energy is trending more and more towards the elimination of heavy oils and coal from the energy sources that we are going to use. In fact, this 21st century is going to be the last century in which the oil will be the prominent actor. It will be replaced by other sources of energy. So the Faja del Orinoco, that has billions of barrels there, will be probably largely left in the ground as stranded assets. Venezuela does not really have a promising oil future. Now, what is the impact of this in the Venezuelan economy? Well, the Venezuelan economy today is facing a big dilemma. The government is facing a dilemma. Either it defaults or it imports food for the people who are hungry. And they cannot do both. There is not enough money to pay debts and to import food at the same time. And part of the government says, let's import less food so that we can keep paying our debts. The other part of half of the government is saying, no, let's declare default and feed our people. I mean, it's a very tragic dilemma facing Venezuela and the government nowadays. Let me give you a few facts about the Venezuelan economy that will describe what is the situation. First of all, we will have a deficit of dollars for 2016 of about $25 billion that will not be in Venezuela when they are needed. GDP is falling by 7% this year. So that's the biggest fall in GDP in the whole world. The inflation is probably close to 700%, which is also the largest in the world. Now, poverty rate, of course, from 2013, that was 35%, is now 65%. It has doubled in only 3 years. Imports are falling by 40% this year as they are forced to pay debts. They still have about $7 billion left to be paid this year, and it will be a matter of either paying that or importing food. International reserves are only about $12 billion, which is half of what they were 6 months ago. And of these 12 billion, about 7 billion are in gold. They are not what you would call liquid reserves. The government is liquidating assets as much as they can. They have collected only half of the money owed to them by countries like Dominican Republic or from Jamaica, because they need the cash. They are selling assets, fire selling assets. Foreign companies are leaving the country. We have Halliburton leaving the country, Schlumberger probably leaving the country because they are not getting paid. So in fact, the government is already in technical default. Even if they don't pay the bond debts, they are not paying their companies doing work in Venezuela. Paradoxically, in a country like Venezuela that has a lot of coke around and many colas, lines, they have coke and they have cola, but they don't have Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is just leaving the country. So you can see that if you put all of these things together, Venezuela is really in a very desperate economic situation. Now, I have an idea of what to do about it, but I'll wait if you want.
For the question.
I'll wait for the question. Sure.
Yeah, let's wait for the question. Yeah, it's a terrible crisis. I have to travel for work to several countries, and when you go to Honduras, and in the past Honduras was a terrible country, still with some violence, but when you see that the situation in Honduras, in Haiti, that they have some future, and you know that the situation in Venezuela is worse than any of the worst country of the region, Venezuela is getting to a place that I think that it is bizarre to see that kind of situation. Even in Cuba, the situation right now is better than Venezuela. Hector, with the international agenda, the letter from Almagro, only Bolivia supported Venezuela in terms of against the letter of Almagro. Nobody else say anything about the letters of Almagro. Next week, probably, it's going to be the Permanent Council session. It's going to take a while until they get a decision, but to try to implement the democratic charter. The General Assembly of the OAS in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and the only countries that Maduro was able to visit was some Caribbean countries. From the international global agenda from Chavez, now the country seems to be limited to some countries in the Caribbean, and the world is looking to Maduro as an authoritarian or dictator. What is your impression about the changes, and what are the opportunities there?
Yeah, well, thanks, Carlos, and everyone else for having me here. I'm the only non-Venezuelan on the panel, by the way. Almost. Yeah, the whole Lopez family always treats me as one. The President Maduro has been doing the usual petro-diplomacy of the past, just this week, with the barrel not at 130 as it used to be, with the barrel at below 40. Nevertheless, there is not enough, I would say today, consensus on whether Almagro will have the 18 votes or not. It's not clear. Many countries are on the fence, Carlos. That's the unfortunate, story here regarding how to vote on the democratic charter for Venezuela. That's one thing. For a variety of reasons. Brazil is unstable. Colombia has the peace process and needs still today Maduro. Argentina's foreign minister is running for the UN Secretary General and is, collecting votes, not, dismissing votes. Spain is in its own dilemmas. They have no government, and they're going to have an election. The international situation is not favorable at all for Venezuelan Democrats. Almagro has been a breath of fresh air at the OAS, and he's committed. He's meeting with opposition leaders virtually every week. But whether there's going to be 18 plus 1 votes next week at the meeting of the Permanent Council, I wouldn't sign it today. I hope there are 18 plus 1 vote to initiate actions on the basis of Article 20 in particular, which allows the Secretary General to travel to Venezuela and holds the Venezuelan government accountable to that on the basis of international agreements, of course. That's one thing. The other thing is that this week in Caracas, last week, UNASUR has been there with Rodriguez Zapatero talking about dialogue. And, dialogue was what happened in dialogue without any conditions was the buzzword in 2014. People were on the streets. Leopoldo had just been arrested. The government was falling. But UNASUR showed up, dialogue. Dialogue was a TV show. And actually was enough to take people out of the streets, take them back home to watch this event on TV. By the time it was over, after 3 sessions in which nothing came out of that, people were at home again and the street was empty. The important thing now for the international community is to, who can reject the idea of a dialogue? But a dialogue with conditions for the government. The legislature must be able to legislate. The judiciary cannot be a tool of the executive anymore. Political prisoners have to be released. Let's have a dialogue, but for that we need a lot more active participation of the international community, including, of course, the OAS and the UN, but including the US government, which is very delicate because whenever the US government shows up in this equation, that's another invasion, in the words of President Maduro, coming up. So, but the international community has to be a lot more active and forceful with regards to the referendum. The referendum, the signatures are there. The referendum has to be conducted this year. It's uphill. It's incredibly uphill after all this description of a dramatic situation in which premature newborns die because hospitals lose electricity and they don't have their own energy groups, and the incubators don't work anymore. And premature babies die in Venezuelan hospitals, just as simple as that. And yet, it's very uphill.
Well, thank you, Hector. And that brings us to the next topic that is from the battlefield, that humanitarian crisis, human rights violations, the experience from fighting those violations in country, and in your role as a family, because not only Leopoldo in jail, there's also part of your family that cannot return to the country because of the El Nacional persecution. So it's your own father who also has been involved in this tragedy in Venezuela. So Diana, just share with us the experience as a human rights activist in country, and as the sister and daughter of two people that have been persecuted directly and aggressively by the regime.
Thank you, Carlos. For me, it's an honor to be here at Freedom House today, an organization that has been fighting for freedom over the world for 75 years. So from somebody who's beginning to be an activist, because I just started 2 years ago because of the protests in 2014, it's an honor for me to be here today. I'm here as a Venezuelan citizen. I live in Venezuela, I live in Caracas, and I have been a witness of what has happened in my country, how it has deteriorated, especially in the human rights. I want to talk today about persecution. Venezuelans are persecuted for different reasons. Who is persecuted? Students are persecuted, political leaders are persecuted, artists are persecuted, journalists, businessmen, people who use Twitter and social media are being persecuted. Homemakers are being persecuted. I mean, everybody can be persecuted. You never know when it's going to be you. If you go to a protest, that might be the day that somebody takes you in jail. It happened to many families with their youth. Their first time that they would be going to protest, maybe they wouldn't return home because the guards took them in prison. In 2014, during the protest, 3,500 people were detained, and mostly they were young men that were detained, students that were detained. Now there are around almost 4,000. The persecution has continued. It hasn't stopped. Why are people being persecuted? Well, anybody who raises their voice in dissent with the government, with Maduro, with Diosdado Cabello, with any of the high elite, may be persecuted. How are we persecuted? Our phones are tapped. We can be followed by government cars. We can be in prison. That's the case of my brother, and right now there are 80 political prisoners still in jail, but at one point there were around 400 people that were in prison, political prisoners. And it can even happen that people can be assassinated. During the protest during 2014, 43 protesters were assassinated, and they were assassinated by government officials or collectives, which is an armed, an armed, unofficial group that the government supports. So that's what can happen if you raise your voice in Venezuela. So I said, who can be in prison? How? Sorry, I need this.
La chuleta.
La chuleta, sí. Well, the problem is that it is a systematic detention. It is not just a political leader that is being detained. It's systematically different people are being detained for raising their voice. In this room, there are 3 families that we have been affected by this persecution. I want to mention a very dear person to me, which is Gustavo Tarre, who is here. He's a constitutional lawyer, a professor of our university, Universidad Central, and he was an important congressman for many years in Venezuela. He did public service for our country. And in May 2014, Jorge Rodriguez, who is the mayor of the city of Caracas, said that he was part of a plan to assassinate the President Maduro and to have a coup. He didn't have any proof of that. He just said that Gustavo Tarres was involved in that. So Gustavo, knowing the situation and knowing that the judicial system is not independent, that the judicial system depends completely from the executive, had to leave our country. And he has been here since. Another case is Zulmaire González, who is a co-founder of Acción por la Libertad that we founded in 2014. Her husband, who is also an international lawyer, Juan Carlos Vargas, he's also a professor. He was also persecuted, and they decided to come to the United States and take political asylum. The third case is my family. My brother has been persecuted not just from 2014. For more than a decade, he has been persecuted. He was politically inhabilitated not to be able to run for office because the government decided that he was very popular and that he had different ideas than what they believed, so they inhabilitated him until 2014. That's when they decided that they should imprison him because the inhabilitation was going to finish. I want to show a video, I don't know if we have it ready, about that moment when this happened in 2014.
Are we in the way?
Esta lucha, hermanas y hermanos, es por todo el pueblo de Venezuela, que hoy está sufriendo cola, está sufriendo escasez. Los jóvenes no tienen empleo, no tienen futuro por un modelo equivocado.
That's the voice of Leopoldo. Those who don't speak Spanish, he's asking that we need to have a change in the country. There you have the proof. It was the government officials who killed the first student who was in the protest. This video was taken from families that were by the windows. This is the voice of Maduro saying that Leopoldo was guilty of that assassination. That's the day, 18th of February, when he handed himself in. He said he was going to face justice, the injustice system. This is a news report, very important, from Últimas Noticias that mentioned how the police was guilty of the crime and Leopoldo wasn't guilty of the crime. From then on, the international community has, the video goes on, you can find it on YouTube. I don't have too much time, that's why I'm not gonna show the whole video. But since that day, since 18th of February 2014, we have dedicated ourselves to raise our voice, but not only in Venezuela. We have done it in Venezuela. We have gone to all the legal system, but we have also learned that we had to go to the international community. We went to Amnesty International, who declared Leopoldo prisoner of conscience last year. We went to the UN. We have gone to the OAS. We have gone to every space that is available to denounce what is happening in Venezuela. Leopoldo is just an example of the many other cases that are happening of human rights violation with political prisoners. I have another video that shows the conditions that Leopoldo is in prison, because he's not only in prison, he is being tortured. He is in solitary confinement since a year ago. He's alone in a building that is a 4-story building. He's in the last floor, and he spends most of the day there, almost around 20 hours. So we have a video that was made about that. They only allow him to have a Bible and 10 books. So when you confront a situation like this and it's your family member, your whole life changes. That's why I became a human rights activist, as all the members in my family. And I want to talk about something in positive. We have organized ourselves. I think the ONGs have the most important role in Venezuela in defending human rights. I did not mention, but also advocates and human rights defenders are being persecuted in Venezuela because of their extraordinary job that they have done denouncing the situation that is happening in Venezuela. We have organized ourselves in different ways. We do a bulletin every week where it's called Political Prisoners. If you are interested, we'll be able to send it to you. We have published books. We have done exhibitions. Everything to bring the awareness to the Venezuelan population, because sometimes, since there's no free media, people don't even know that is happening. So I think that's
perfect. No, thank you very much for your for the video, for the truly sincere fight that you have been putting together, all the impact of the Leopoldo's family and the international level, meetings with the several presidents, meetings with parliamentarians, meetings with the international institutions. I think that there has been an effective campaign, and not only for Leopoldo, for all the political prisoners that remains in Venezuela, or the people persecuted by the regime. There are 80 political prisoners, but all the rest of the people who has been involved in any activity that the government consider against them, they have an open cause, they have an open process, and the government continue the persecution against them. We have an extraordinary different views or different approaches to the situation in Venezuela, the same view about the problem, and I think that drives us to a new view of how we're gonna approach that. What elements we can use in the case of Venezuela. We're gonna open the panel for discussion Q&A from all the participants right now, and we're gonna distribute but I want to see any one of you who can share what is the alternative right now. It is the referendum. It is a well-planned dialogue. What is your view in terms of what it's going to be the future of Venezuela? What's going to happen in the upcoming month with the crisis in Venezuela, the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela?
I'll go first.
You go first. Okay.
When you have a situation like the one Venezuela is confronting right now, I think you have to do all three. Mm-hmm. And which of those will work out? I think active resistance is the only one that will eventually work out, but you have to be trying which is what Venezuelans are doing right now. The problem with active resistance is that it lacks visible leadership. You have an opposition table that in some way seems to be engaged with the government in this everlasting dialogue that leads to nowhere but some kind of a codependency situation. So I'm not saying that should not continue, that opposition, the formal official opposition, should continue to do whatever dialogue they feel they can implement. But I think what needs to happen right now is that active resistance, civil resistance, becomes more visible, more massive, and that there are some leaders that I think Leopoldo should be freed and liberated, but the government, I don't think, will ever do that.
Yeah.
So, because the Cubans will advise them not to do that.
Yeah, Gustavo, what do you think about the economy, the situation of the country?
Everybody is calling for dialogue in Venezuela. From the Pope downwards, everybody is calling for dialogue. We should dialogue. We should sit with these guys and talk it over and negotiate, which is an even uglier word to me. I reject the idea of negotiations and dialogue. I believe the country is too far gone, materially and spiritually. Our country is in ruins. And these 16 years of Chavez and Maduro have created millions of people who are now dependent on the welfare state to give them handouts in exchange for political loyalty. We have a mass that is impossible. It's a big load on the Venezuelan of the future. If we have a very tragic present, we have even an uglier future. Millions of Venezuelans who are used now to depend on the state for handouts, free food, to make long lines, to wait for 1 kilo of rice here and there. And I say that the only way we can recover the dignity of the Venezuelan society or the Venezuelan nation is rebelling. We have to go into a civic rebellion, which, by the way, has nothing to do with being unconstitutional. Articles 333 and 350 of the Venezuelan Constitution actually demand from Venezuelans to restitute democracy and freedom in the country whenever this democracy and this freedom has been eliminated, which is clearly the case today in Venezuela. I don't believe in sitting around the table with a bunch of gangsters. And in fact, I believe that it would be very unfair for the Venezuelans of the future to let these guys go abroad to enjoy their ill-gotten money without any punishment. I believe that justice has to be done if Venezuela is ever going to recover their dignity, their national dignity.
Victor, related to one of the questions, all this movement around the region, the CICIG in Guatemala, masses in Honduras, Lavallado in Brazil, all this effort to fight against impunity, corruption in the region. How do you see that in terms of the impact in Venezuela in the upcoming months and the upcoming
Well,
years?
Venezuela is probably the most corrupt of all the countries you mentioned in terms of the capacity of corruption to control the state, 100% of the state apparatus. That's something new in Latin America. It's hopeful, one should say, that societies are not willing to put up with corruption anymore. That's how Pérez Molina fell. That's how Dilma and Lula fell. Lula wasn't in power, but had to do with that. And that is healthy, however unstable it makes things in the short run. Speaking to one little thing about Venezuela is that it's interesting because I don't know if the audience knows that when the opposition says the government must respect the Constitution, it's the government's Constitution that the government is not capable of respecting. This Constitution was passed in 1999 by Hugo Chavez. It's its own freely designed institutional mechanism and structure to govern the country that the government itself cannot fulfill anymore. That's interesting. The referendum, the opposition won an election that gives them now control of the legislature, of the National Assembly. Well, the government has de facto dismissed the legislature in a sort of Fujimorazo, the old Fujimori dismissal of Congress, via the judiciary, which has never, ever ruled against the executive. That is, the magnitude of this political tragedy. The government has its own institutional architecture in place, willingly designed and implemented. It cannot respect it.
Diana, the support from the regime. This is a massive humanitarian crisis that is human rights violations. And apart from the ones receiving money directly from the government or engaged in the corruption, there are still some social groups supporting Maduro. Why is that? Why is still some kind of small popularity, but there's some support remaining for Maduro in the country?
Well, very little support. I don't know exact number, but it's around 15%, which it's almost non-existent, right? In a political sense. Why? Because those people depend directly on the government. The government has created, as Gustavo explained very well, a dependent society on the government, and that's why they're still there with them. I don't think it depends. It has anything to do with ideology. It has to do with dependency.
No, Almagro said that it's not a socialist country in Venezuela anymore. Maduro is not a socialist. It's a crazy goat.
Yes, I think what has happened in Venezuela is...
Nika say crazy goats, and Almagro just say that it's not a socialist country anymore.
Don't insult the goats.
I think it never was. It was disfrazado. It was... It tried to become a socialist government, but it never was. I think it's definitely an authoritarian military government, and it is a dictatorship.
Gustavo, there's a question specifically for you. It's the Venezuelan economic problem is due to the fall in oil prices, which causes the fall in the currency, making imports expensive and increase inability to pay debt and to borrow money. Should the international organizations assist monetarily and stop denegating effects of the oil crisis? So it is more like it's an economic problem due to the fall in the oil prices, the current crisis in Venezuela, or there's something more than that?
Yeah, well, it's something more than that. Actually, whoever tells you that falling oil prices are the reason why Venezuela is like it is feeding you a lot of you know what. In fact, oil prices declined about 7-8 months ago, or say a year ago. But Venezuela, or the oil industry in Venezuela, has been collapsing for about 7 or 8 years already. Ever since PDVSA, rather than being an oil company, became a company importing chickens and distributing chickens, importing food that was already rotten before it started the way to Venezuela. And they are now milking cows and very proud of cultivating rice. And they are doing a lot of things that have nothing to do with oil. They have, Petróleos de Venezuela became a social-oriented company, building houses and doing all kinds of things. I mean, this disastrous policy is the reason why the oil industry in Venezuela is totally in ruins. The debt of Petróleos de Venezuela today is over $100 billion. And if you go to see the installations of the Venezuelan oil industry, they are in total state of disrepair because the money that should have gone into reinvestment and maintenance has gone to finance Chavez's presidential campaign in 2012. You know, we owe China $70 billion already. We owe Japan. I mean, we owe everybody. And that's because the oil industry has gone into things that have nothing to do with oil.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Hilda, you have experience working with the IMF. You had some connections with the private sector, with World Bank, with international institutions. What do you think is going to be the role of the regional organization, apart from UNASUR or the ECOWAS, dealing with the crisis in Venezuela? With the humanitarian crisis, with the political crisis, rebuilding institutions, what do you think is going to be the role of those organizations in Venezuela?
Well, the role of international multilateral organizations would be to provide financing for the recovery, the restructuring of the Venezuelan economy. My rough calculation is that Venezuela will need $100 to $200 billion over the next 5 to 10 years to begin to recover from the destruction that has taken place. But no multilateral organization would be in a position to lend a cent to Venezuela other than the Chinese while the current regime is in place. It's a little bit, we're reminded of what's happening in Haiti. There are still billions of dollars waiting to reach Haiti that have been promised that are not getting to Haiti because the government is so corrupt that no organization in their right minds would be sending any kind of money other than China. And China is extracting a significant pound of flesh. No one knows what kinds of agreements Venezuela is agreeing to with China because those are not made public. But I understand that they are the only likely lender, so that Venezuela will not default on its international debt this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, it has been an extraordinary panel. We almost getting to the point of not returning in terms of the time, but I want to give you each one of you last words, 2 minutes each one to share with us how you see how the United States can be more propositive, how the international community, what else we can do as in terms of the international community, and the final words about what do you expect from Venezuela in terms of human rights, in terms of the economy. Hector, do you want to begin with some words, 2 minutes?
Sure. The priority is humanitarian aid. The disaster, the humanitarian disaster is there, and it's going to get only worse in the next few months. Some experts say that beyond September is just sheer fortune that this doesn't become a complete humanitarian disaster, a complete humanitarian collapse. And all the international organizations, from the Red Cross to Doctors Without Borders and everybody else, should be ready to act. And a part of the dialogue that they're having today should be also about opening the borders to international humanitarian aid, because the government is so perverse that it doesn't allow that to happen. It's, I mean, several organizations, governments, and multilateral organizations are ready to act, but the government doesn't let them. And well, that has to be part of, the dialogue that presumably is going to happen. It has to take care of that, and the border has to be open for international humanitarian aid to get into the country.
Gustavo?
Well, I hope that Venezuelans can come together and go into a massive civic protest, if you wish, a rebellion, in which general strikes and sit-outs in the streets and avenues can be done, all in a peaceful manner. If there is any repression, sections of the army have already said they will not allow the repression, large-scale repression against Venezuelans. And if this is done in combination with international pressure, I would say OAS sanctioning Venezuela very explicitly. I think we have a chance of ousting this government in a much more expedited way than if we have to wait and see whether the referendum works or doesn't work.
Yeah, they need to have international pressure and national pressure at the same time to help them to realize that they have to move forward and allow the Venezuelans to be free. And you're going to be the last one. I promise that. Hilda, what do you think about this?
The international community has to become really aware that what's going on in Venezuela is much worse than the Zika virus. It is a true humanitarian crisis in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't think the media has begun reporting on what's going on in Venezuela, but it's very limited relative to how they report on political candidates here on Zika virus, for God's sake. Because the people who are dying from the humanitarian crisis are multiples of what could possibly die from the Zika virus around the world. So I agree with the comments that have been made that humanitarian aid should be allowed in. I don't think the government will allow it because it would be admitting that they have collapsed, but they should be allowed. And in fact, they have never allowed humanitarian aid to come in except from Cuba and for a big price to pay to the Cubans. So maybe the Cubans should be the ones supplying the humanitarian aid, and that would be one way of actually making it happen. I agree with what Gustavo has said, that there has to be a general uprising, a constitutionally sanctioned uprising. But, that's easier for us to say. We're here, and the people who need to do it are the people who are in Venezuela. And there needs to be leadership that it's expressed and that leads that general uprising, and very few people have the valor that Leopoldo has exhibited and for which he has been imprisoned. Mm-hmm. So that's a very tough one to pull. Mm-hmm. And eventually you hope that the military will end up, that some factions in the military will end up establishing order under a new regime, however we get there, and that the international community the multilateral organizations begin lending money and restructuring the economy. There is a human capital with which to fix the problems, but the problems are not easily fixed. No. It will take many years to see Venezuela prospering again, even if everything goes right.
Yeah, Diana, well, it's a mixed thing. You're going to have your 2 minutes. But in terms of reconciliation, the country has to go to a reconciliation process. You are the direct family of one of the political prisoners, and you have been impacted by the rest of them. You have been in contact with Roslyn, with all the political prisoners and all the families. It is space for reconciliation in Venezuela. There's a possibility to a peaceful process in Venezuela. And also your final words.
Thank you. Well, I am optimistic, even though such a pessimistic overview we have just given to the audience. I am optimistic because of the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelan people have demonstrated that they are democratic. Every time there's an election, the people go to the election, the people go peacefully to the election, and the people believe in the Constitution. So I am optimistic that with the people, the change is going to be able to happen. I think I would like to read some words of my brother because he's more eloquent in this manner than I am. We were able to make this book. It's called Prisoner but Free, to be a free prisoner, which is a paradox, but that's how he feels. I helped him write this book. The notes that were written during the trial, and we were able to get them out because we usually cannot get any notes, any letters, any books out of Ramo Verde. But, well, we use our creativity. That's something that is very Venezuelan. Mm-hmm. So with our creativity and our courage and our belief in freedom, we did this book that hopefully we will be able to translate in English. Right now you can find it in Amazon only in Spanish. So I'm going to translate. Leopoldo says, Venezuela, don't give not even a centimeter to desesperanza. What would that?
Hopelessness.
Despair.
Hopelessness. Despair.
So we're talking about that. Not a centimeter to despair. I am in prison, but I am free. As the whole country, all the Venezuelans are also in prison. We are in prison in front of corruption, in front of insecurity, in front of repression, in front of an anti-democratic system. But we are free in our potential to be free. The potential, the aspiration of the collective aspiration of a common dream, of a promised land, that we can get there. In that ideal, I know we can find freedom. And that freedom materializes when each person can conquest their potential of their own aspiration and of their own rights, without restrictions and without obstacles put by those who run power. A state is immoral if it's not dedicated to generate the conditions for all citizens to be free. So these are the words of Leopoldo from Ramo Verde.
Well, it's good to end with that.